Okay, so welcome back everyone. This is our lengthy lecture series on the history of video games. Although the last numerous lectures we've been doing the history of games before video games, and we're getting close to the end of that. Um, Tonight we're going to be discussing the history of pinball. And pinball obviously has had a huge impact on the world of video games. Not just in terms of the fact that pinball games often get adapted into video games, creating the whole video pinball genre, but also the fact that it really kind of set the stage for how arcades would work. It created a lot of the sort of convention stuff like high scores and such, as we'll see. And it really just had a huge impact. A lot of early games kind of modeled themselves off of pinball. So it'll be fun to see how it developed. So without any further ado, let's switch over to the slideshow. So yeah. So pinball. Well, before we go into pinball, we're going to be going all the way back in history because apparently before there was pinball, there were quite a few other games, and there's actually quite a lineage that goes all the way back to the point where games like croquet, pinball, pachinko, and pool, aka billiards, all share sort of a common ancestor. We'll be discussing that. So let's jump right into it. So the earliest ancestor of these sorts of games is what's known as lawn bowling. Lawn bowling is a family of games that's been played at least since ancient Greece. It usually involves rolling or throwing balls around a field to either knock things over or land in a hole or try to get as close as possible to another ball. One game that I actually played some back in my youth was Bocce. Bocce is an Italian game where the idea is that you throw one ball and then the other and it lands in the middle of the field, and then the other players try to roll a ball so that it lands as close as possible to that one ball as they can get it, and try to knock each other's balls out of the way as well. It's quite fun. In fact, I think I still have that kit. It's probably lying around somewhere. But yeah, but lawn bowling, it's been around since forever, and there are quite a few different variations of it. Now, this eventually led to a whole family of what are known as lawn games, which is to say they're generally played on sort of flat, even ground with sort of relatively with sort of low grass. And throughout the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, these sorts of games gained a great deal of popularity throughout Western Europe. Um, One in particular that became very popular is called ground billiards, and these games involved hitting balls around a field using clubs or mallets, as you can kind of see from this picture here. This kind of gives you a rough idea of what it was like. Now, this would eventually lead to the creation of games like croquet and other such sports. Um, and as the name would suggest, these games were the predecessor to the modern game of billiards, as eventually people wanted to play indoor versions of them. Now, billiards itself came about around the 1500s or so. Um, Many of these outdoor lawn games were being adapted for play inside as parlor games, and instead of utilizing mallets or clubs, players instead utilized sticks with blunt tips called cues. And this, of course, it created an entire family of games in its own right that would eventually evolve into pool. And pool, of course, can be played in a wide variety of different configurations and rule sets. Pool or billiards is generally played by using cues to knock balls into various pockets along the edge of the table. But again, in terms of the specifics of it, there are quite a number of different rule sets out there. I generally whenever I'm playing with my friends, I generally tend to prefer stripes and solids, but there are plenty of others as well. And indeed, if you've ever wondered why it is that pool tables use sort of green felt, it's because it's meant to sort of mimic the sort of look and feel of the shortcut lawns that these older lawn games were played on. Now, one lawn game that became fairly popular in England at around the 17th century is called Nine Holes. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find any images of this game. I have seen pictures of it, so I know it was a real game. But for whatever reason, I just could not find any actual pictures of it for use in this presentation. It was so called that because it involved rolling a ball into one of nine holes that were clustered together. And as with many such lawn games, Nine Holes was eventually adapted for indoor play by the French, and it was called bagatelle. And we'll actually get into why it's called that in a minute. Now, players utilize a cue to knock balls from one side of the board to the other, where they attempt to land them in one of nine holes. In some variations, wooden pins are added as obstacles, and because of the nuisance of having to constantly reset fallen pins, they were nailed to the board, with the skilled players being able to perform skill shots by ricocheting the balls off of them. Now, this game was showcased at a party in honor of King Louis XVI in 1777 at the Chateau de Bagatelle, which is why it's called that. The game Bagatelle caught on, and soon it would spread all throughout France. And by the late 1700s, the game had become popular throughout much of Europe as well. Now, eventually, the game spread across the Atlantic. During the American Revolution, the U.S. had an alliance with France, and as a result, many French officers began to introduce their American counterparts to the game. Which, man, I can imagine that having to ship a bagatelle board all the way across the Atlantic must have been a bit of a hassle. But it really caught on over here, and it soon became known as the American Army game. By the mid 1800s, the wooden pegs had begun to be replaced with brass pins, which would eventually lead to the name pinball. And the game became very popular throughout the U.S. In fact, we can see here is a political cartoon that shows Abe Lincoln playing bagatelle. Now, another sort of variation on bagatelle that became popular in the UK was called Cockamaroo. The game added scoring troughs to keep track of the score, and there were also shooting lanes. So we can see here that the person would sort of shoot their balls into these holes, and then they would come out over down here, which would indicate what their scores were. The game was very commonly played as a gambling sport. So was bagatelle over as well, but this one especially. Now, an early version of Cockamaroo that was introduced to the U.S. and that sort of introduced and combined elements with a traditional bagatelle was called Tivoli. The game had players use cues to knock balls up a set of alleys that were then where they would then fall down the board through a number of pins into one of several slots. And you can kind of see how elements of it are turning into pinball. You can, for one thing, we now have the shooting lanes that we're familiar with today. Now, the game became extremely popular in saloons and gambling dens throughout the U.S. Now, eventually, in 1871, American inventor Montague Redgrave would create an improved version of Bagatelle. And in fact, he literally called his invention improvements on Bagatelle. Um, aside from the usual scoring holes, his version also utilized bells that could be rung for points. But his most important contribution was replacing the cues with a spring loaded ball launcher, which, yes, is the same sort used in pinball today. This is sort of, I believe this is the model that he sent the patent office. So it's a little shrunken down. The um, the official boards would have been somewhat bigger. This is kind of more of a prototype. Um, but yeah, the game would prove to be very popular in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And here we can actually see this is the actual patent that he was issued. Now, one form of this game that was very popular back in the day was called log cabin. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, coin operated amusement machines had become increasingly common. Coin operated machines had started off for vending machines, but eventually they started being used for amusement purposes. And this game, Log Cabin, was created in 1901. It could be found in hundreds of saloons and bars throughout the U.S. in the early 1900s. It generally cost 5 cents to play, which was actually not a small amount back then. Well, it wasn't a huge amount, but generally most of amusement machines in the early 1900s only cost 1 cent. Um, the machine contained 250 steel balls, which can be loaded into the launcher using the knob on the front of the machine. But otherwise, it plays like traditional Trivoli, again with the spring-loaded ball launcher. So the first electrified Bagatelle game was created by Harry Reid of Salem, Massachusetts in the early 1900s. I don't think we actually know what the exact year, but he took a folding Bagatelle board and added flashing red, white, and blue lights to form a crude backboard. Only one of these machines was ever built, and it was displayed at various carnivals and fairs. Unfortunately, I can't find any images of this device. It appears like it has been lost to time, but it was very much ahead of its time. Like it would take decades before Bagatelle or Pinball would start to implement electrified elements or things like a back glass. And in fact, it wouldn't be until the late 1920s before the next electrified Bagatelle machines would appear. Now, the bagatelle industry, and more specifically the American amusement industry, would suffer several major setbacks in the 1910s and 1920s. First, in April 6th, 1917, the United States would enter World War I on the side of the Allies, and most manufacturing was diverted to war production, leaving almost no room for amusement machines. Secondly, the prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s resulted in most of the nation's bars and saloons shutting down. And thirdly, the rise in popularity of movie theaters, which rapidly became the nation's primary form of entertainment, very much pulled people away from the various amusement centers, which were known as penny arcades back then. We'll discuss more about penny arcades in the next unit, in the next section. But yeah. Now we're going to go on a bit of a diversion here to because a game that would end up having another massive influence on gaming as a whole would end up being born from Bagatelle as well as Pinball. So, in the 1920s, a smaller tabletop version of Bagatelle was created for children, and it was called the Corinth game or Corinthian Bagatelle. It was originally created in Chicago, but it soon gained popularity in Japan, where it was commonly featured in candy stores. Children would play the game and try to get high scores with candy as the prize. Children in Japan commonly referred to this game as Pachi Pachi, based on the onomatopoeia for the balls striking the brass pins. So basically, that's kind of the sound that it makes. This would, of course, eventually lead to the creation of pachinko, um, which would occur in the 1930s in Japan. This is a gambling game wherein players attempt to launch a series of silver balls into holes on the board. The game was extremely popular, with numerous pachinko parlors popping up all over Japan. Now, pachinko would end up being temporarily outlawed during World War II, but it made an immediate resurgence afterward, and it remained Japan's national gambling obsession until rather recently, when it was surpassed by patchy slots, which are basically just slot machines. Now, this is an example of sort of an old school pachinko machine here. But of course, they would become much more advanced later on. This is kind of an example of a later one. Later pachinko machines would incorporate electro-mechanical elements, including lights, moving gates, and even screens which displayed basic graphics and video. The point where I believe that there are even some pachinko games where essentially it'll play almost like a story or something like that, where if you want to see all the way to the end, you need to keep scoring. Instead of a plunger, more modern pachinko machines have players feed their balls into the machine, with the launcher being automatic and its power controlled by a knob on the front of the machine. What little skill is involved is based around fine tuning the launcher and trying to find a sweet spot where it will consistently launch the ball into a high scoring hole. Of course, this being a gambling game, there's only so much skill that can be applied. Now, the balls are both used to play and to cash out. When the player scores, they get more balls, which they can use to play more if they want to, or they can be exchanged for prizes. So, in a sense, you have to spend balls to make balls. Uh, Freudian slip there. Um, Now, pachinko parlors, part of the reason why they're so popular is that they kind of skirt around Japan's gambling regulations because there's no direct payout. Instead, the balls are exchanged for a toy or prize, which then can be taken to a nearby pawn shop and exchanged for cash. Now, moving back over to America, as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the Great Depression hit. Millions of people were out of work and seeking cheap entertainment to distract them from their worries. For that matter, the end of Prohibition also meant that taverns and bars could now operate in the open again. As a result, the amusement industry flourished, and many skilled engineers and carpenters were now out of work and desperate to find a way to make money. And as a result, this would lead to numerous innovations, as we will soon see. Um, this is Wiffle. In 1930, a farmer and carpenter named Arthur Paulin created a homemade bagatelle game for his daughter for Christmas. After seeing how much she enjoyed it and how popular it became among neighborhood children, Paulin became convinced of the device's commercial viability. He partnered with his friend Earl Froome. Yes, that's really his name. And together they created Wiffle. Wiffle is considered by many to be the first true pinball machine, although that title is rather debatable. Uh, you know, uh, the line between bagatelle and pinball is rather blurred, to be honest. The board is much more complex than most other such games, and 1 cent could get you 10 balls, with which the goal was to get the highest score. The two would create Automatic Industries, which was the first manufacturer dedicated solely to pinball. Now, this would eventually lead to, in 1927, a young entrepreneur named David Gottlieb and his brother Sol Gottlieb would found the company David Gottlieb and Co., which would be dedicated to the creation and manufacture of amusement machines. And in 1931, they would launch their first pinball machine, Baffle Ball. This was the first mass produced and mass marketed pinball machine. The game would prove to be immensely successful and profitable. Uh, and in total, over 60,000 units would be produced. Gottlieb would go on to become one of the biggest and most important pinball creators in the world. And in fact, to the point where up until about the 1970s, they were pretty much the number one creators of pinball in the world. Pretty much all of the most of the most popular and innovative sort of pinball machines will come from Gottlieb, although there will be some competition. Now, in fact, right away, now due to the immense popularity of Baffle Ball, Gottlieb would end up partnering with several distributors to meet demand. One of these was called Lion Manufacturer, and an employee that worked for this company was named Ray Maloney. Maloney was inspired by the potential of pinball, and so he ended up creating his own version called Ballyhoo. Now, to be honest, Ballyhoo was a fairly blatant Baffle Ball ripoff, albeit with some aesthetic enhancements. But the game ended up being a massive success, and Maloney created his own pinball manufacturing company that he called Bally. Bally would also end up becoming a major player in the pinball industry and one of Gottlieb's primary competitors. All of this would lead to what is now known as the Pinball Patent Wars. Now, the early 1930s saw a massive explosion in the popularity of pinball. Like literally, there wasn't enough being produced to meet demand, and as a result, countless copycats came out of the woodworks as everyone attempted to hop on the gravy train. This was further bolstered by the fact that Wiffle's patent application had been rejected, meaning that anyone could copy the design. By 1933, more than 75 pinball manufacturers existed in the US, with the number eventually ballooning to an astounding 150. Copying was rampant, and in fact, and the and pinball manufacturing was primarily centered in Chicago at this time. Chicago was very much a major manufacturing hub in the U.S. at the time, and uh, and as a result, though, this was Chicago in the 1930s, meaning that, of course, there was organized crime got involved with it before too long. This led to a number of instances of racketeering with thugs being frequently hired to smash competitors' tables. So yeah, things kind of got a bit out of hand and somewhat violent. As far as I know, I don't think anyone died as a result of this. At least I hope not. Um, Although this also led to innovation, as pinball creators were constantly trying to one up the copycats and introduce unique elements that would set their tables apart from seas of clones. This was overall a very chaotic period for pinball. There was a ton of intense competition, constant lawsuits, companies going out of business, and more. And in fact, by 1934, only 14 pinball manufacturers had survived, including Gottlieb and Bally. The companies that did survive were generally the best and most innovative. The top four companies that would emerge from this period were Gottlieb, Bally, Chicago Coin, and Genco, respectively. And they were the top four in terms of sales. So Gottlieb was at the top, and then followed by Bally, and so on and so forth. And indeed, Chicago would very much remain the heartland of pinball manufacturing for most of the 20th century. Like, there would eventually be some competition in places like Europe and such, but it would take a while. Now, this leads us to one of the most important, if not the most important, and influential pinball designers of all time, Harry Williams. Harry Williams, he was born in 1903, died in 1983, and which means that he would have only been in his late 20s when he entered his career in the coin-op industry as an independent consultant in 1932. The next year, he would create his first pinball table, which was called Advance, and he would go on to pioneer many technical innovations that have since become common in pinball today. And he would eventually go on to found Williams Manufacturing in 1944. His first really big hit would be in 1933, the same year he made his first pinball machine. So he really hit the ground running, I guess you could say. And it was called Contact, and it's credited as being the first electro-mechanical pinball machine. The game was powered by three dry cell batteries, as opposed to simply plugging it into the wall, I guess because these were meant to be semi-portable. And if a for one thing, it featured a switch at the top of the board that could be triggered by sending the ball over it. Uh, and if that happened, then if the ball landed in one of the lower scoring holes, a solenoid, which is a type of mechanical device that pushes things out, would knock it out of the hole, where it might hopefully land in a higher scoring hole. The game was later updated to also produce a buzzing sound when the player scored, making it the first pinball game to utilize sound effects. All of this made for a much more engaging and exciting game, and as a result, it became a massive hit. This is a picture of it, although I think this is a sort of miniaturized version of it called Contact Junior, which, yeah, I believe that the actual machine is a bit bigger. Now, one of Harry Williams' most important innovations was the tilt mechanism. This device was designed to prevent players from cheating by tilting the table to influence the ball's trajectory. The first device he created to do this he called a stool pigeon. He was from Chicago after all. It consisted of a ball balancing on a raised stool within a metal cup. If the table was tilted, the ball would fall off the stool and make contact with the cup, which would then lock up the machine. And eventually this would evolve into the pendulum tilt mechanisms that we have today. Now, of course, as you can see from this diagram here, it's really a very simple but rather ingenious mechanism. It's simply like a metal rod with a weight at the end that is allowed to sort of hang freely, and if it tilts, the it makes contacts with the edges of this ring, and there's sort of an electric current that goes through it, so it knows if it's made contact or not, and if it has, then it locks up the board. Now, another major innovation was in 1936, Bally would release Bumper, which is the first pinball machine to utilize the now ubiquitous bumper. Which, yeah, it's such an element that we associate with pinball. It's hard to believe it took this long for it to be introduced, but here we go. Now, unlike previous pinball machines where scoring was accompanied primarily by sending the ball into a hole, in this game the player scored when the ball made contact with one of several electrified springs. After which the ball might remain in play, and as such, skill shifted from aiming for the highest scoring hole to getting the ball to stay in play while ricocheting off of as many bumpers as possible. So it really made for a much more sort of, I guess, longer lasting and more exciting game. Now, it was also around this time when another element of pinball that we would recognize today was first introduced, and that is back glass. Like, if we take a look at some of these earlier boards, we can see here there's nothing behind it. It's just the board and nothing else. The back glass is the element that is on the back of the board that contains like all of the artwork and stuff, and they would this was part of a sort of general movement to make pinball machines flashier in an attempt to draw more customers. And they would add more lights, more sound effects, and electrical components. Um, and They were often also used to display rather colorful art, and usually they would have light bulbs behind a portion of the board lighting up, which would light up to display the player's score. So back before we had sort of score reels, the way that it would work is that when you scored 1,000 points, this part would light up. When you scored 2,000, this would light up, so on and so forth. They started off rather small and simple, but over time they became much larger and more elaborate. You know, this is, and some of them would even go on to feature things like moving elements and even like small animations. After a while, backglass stuff would get quite elaborate after a while. But of course, one can't talk about pinball art from this period without talking about Roy Parker and George Melenton. Now, as pinball became more visually engaging, it began to utilize more elaborate artwork. At the time, tables were designed without artwork in mind, which they were kind of created without themes or anything else in mind. They were just the mechanics, and that was it. They would then outsource the artwork to a company called Advertising Posters. Their two best artists that were regularly assigned to work on pinball tables were Roy Parker and George Melenton. And they would end up being extremely prolific. In fact, they were more or less responsible for nearly all pinball art until the 1970s. During which time they developed a highly distinctive style, and were in particular they were rather well known for their use of scantily clad women in their art. This is very much an example. They did this obviously because they thought it would attract customers. The obvious idea being, sex sells. And I actually have, here's just a few examples of their artwork. You can see that they kind of have a very consistent sort of feel to them. Yeah, here's even more, and of course you can see that they made plenty of scantily clad women because that's what you want to see. But yeah, and apparently this strategy was successful because they did manage to attract quite a few young men with this artwork. Now, ultimately, of course, there would come another world war, which would also be very disruptive for the pinball industry. In 1941, America joined World War II on the side of the Allies, and many materials that were necessary for the creation of pinball tables were no longer available. This was due to the demands of total war. Pinball manufacturing was almost entirely halted, with factories being retooled to create military equipment to support the war effort. Well, there would be some attempts to circumvent this, like Harry Williams attempted to keep things going by creating a company that would retool old machines, but it was never really all that successful, at least as far as I can tell. But beyond that, a bigger problem was also on the horizon, and that around this time, pinball began to be seen as controversial due to its links to gambling. Again, early pinball was much more reliant on luck than what we have today, and many machines often offered prizes and in some cases even cash payouts if you could get a high enough score. So yeah, honestly, the association with gambling was not unfounded. These really were gambling machines. Like, I hate to say it, but it's true. Now, granted, there were some pinball machines that were created for amusement purposes only. In those, I believe that rather than getting a prize, if you got a high enough score, you'd essentially just get a free game. But in general, pinball machines of this era really had more in common with slot machines than what we have today. There were very few skill elements. This was a time before things like flippers existed, for example. So once you launched the ball, that was it. You know, you and as a result, though, the game was associated with low lives and gangsters, a perception that would persist for decades, to the point where actually kind of a common trope that would occur in a lot of sort of movies and TV shows is if you want to show a character who you want to show that he's either that he's maybe a bad guy or that he's, say, a rebel or a bad boy or something like where he doesn't play by the rules. What do? You show him playing pinball. You introduce him by showing him playing pinball. That's how strong that sort of association was at the time. And many considered pinball to be harmful to society. None more so than New York City Mayor Farella LaGuardia. Yes, the same person who LaGuardia Airport is named after, as well as a number of other things. He was kind of a big deal. Now, on top of being associated with gambling, pinball was also seen as a waste of resources that could be better served helping the war effort. And in 1942, pinball was banned in New York State, with many other states following suit. As a publicity stunt, Mayor LaGuardia had several photo shoots where he would basically go around and smash pinball tables. You can see one of those photos here. Now, the pinball ban would remain until 1976. And I believe that although that was the pinball ban in New York, I believe that that the last state pinball ban would remain for a decent while longer. And I believe that it actually probably wasn't until fairly recently that the last sort of town level sort of pinball bans were lifted. So yeah, it took a while to really sort of undo this. Now, in now we'll jump back to our friend Harry Williams, who in 1943 would sell his share of United Manufacturing to create his own company called Williams. Now, almost immediately, Williams would set itself apart for its innovative designs. Up until the and indeed, up until the 1970s, the top four pinball companies would be Gottlieb, Bally, Williams, and Chicago Coin in that order. And they would go, and of course, Williams would also go on to make a number of arcade games during the arcade golden age, most notably Defender, for example. Now, of course, World War II ended in 1945, and this brought an end to the resource rationing that had stifled the pinball industry. Despite many states banning pinball, the post war era saw demand for the game explode once again. Nevertheless, many pinball manufacturers decided to diversify into other amusement and gambling products, and pinball itself would begin to move away sort of from its association with gambling. Um, yeah, during the war, a number of pinball machines had been brought overseas for play by U.S. servicemen, as well as sort of in the immediate aftermath of the war. And this led to pinball gaining an international audience, especially in Japan and Europe. And by the 1960s, more than half of all pinball machines manufactured in the US were being exported overseas, which shows again how popular it was. And this would eventually lead to the creation of of Japanese and European pinball manufacturers, although that doesn't really come until later. Now, we're gonna have to kind of sidetrack just a little bit to talk about a different category of games called pitch and bat games. These emerged in the 1930s and 40s, and they were part of a larger genre of mechanical sports games, many of which are actually quite interesting, and we will be getting into them in sort of the next lecture. Um, but in these pitch and bat games, a ball is launched from the top of the table towards the bottom. The player operates a mechanical bat with the goal of knocking the ball into one of several holes in the field without striking out. So you can see here that it's so that you strike out by landing in the hole next to the players, but you score points by landing it in one of these areas in the outfield. Now, this style of game would prove to be fairly popular. In fact, I think that they still even make some of these today. They're not nearly as popular as they used to be, but I have actually seen these around on occasion. In particular, I remember a number of years ago I played one that used a gumball as a ball, and the idea was that if you scored a hit with it, you would get the gumball essentially. But take a look at this thing, the mechanical bat. It's basically just a simple sort of lever that you use to hit the ball. But doesn't this look kind of familiar? Some of you might be thinking, yeah, this looks a bit like a pinball flipper. And indeed, it's what would inspire it. So yeah, we've reached 1947, and only now have we reached the advent of the pinball flipper with the game Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty was created by Gottlieb and designed by Harry Davis, and it was the first pinball machine to utilize flippers. Although they used it in quite a different way than how we have it today. Uh, they had like six of them along each side of the board, uh, as you can kind of see here, rather than at the bottom. I think I heard someone refer to this design as the pinball centipede. But this really gave the game an added level of player control that was instrumental in transforming pinball from a game of luck to a game of skill. It also kept the ball in play longer, leading to more exciting games. You know, the game. Now, obviously, this was a massive leap forward for the medium and something that would become ubiquitous going forward. Although it would take a bit of time before the layout that we sort of recognize today would come into being. Example of that would be next year's Triple Action by Genko. Now, this game it had two flippers at the bottom of the table like what we have today. However, they're very different. In this case, they're backwards. Like they they flip this like they flip like this rather than like this, and so yeah, they still haven't quite nailed it down. A lot of companies were kind of experimenting with flippers in terms of number of flippers and flipper placements. At the time, games could have two, four, or even just one flipper. It was kind of the Wild West of flipper design at the time. Now, a couple of other innovations that came about at around the same time were thumper bumpers, although they were also sometimes known as pop, jet, or cyclonic bumpers. And what these bumpers did is that they actually propelled the ball away from it when struck. Um, and this allowed for a much more kinetic and exciting game. Now, then there's also the slingshot or kicking rubbers. They also became a common feature on pinball tables, usually at the bottom of the table near the flippers. These bounce the ball away when struck. And of course, both of these led to much faster and more exciting gameplay. Now, this table, it's called Four Horsemen, which is not an apocalypse themed board. It's more so based around football. It was released by Gottlieb in 1950. But by now, we can see that the flippers are more or less oriented how we have them today, although this gap in the middle is rather large. And it was actually the first pinball game to feature a safety gate, which would prevent the ball from draining until it had been in play for a certain period of time. The way that it worked is that essentially, like this bit at the bottom here, it would sort of raise up, and so if the ball hadn't been in play long enough, it would sort of fall down the board, hit this gate, and go straight to the flippers, rather than draining. Now, up until this point, as I mentioned before, point scores were most commonly displayed by lighting up different parts of the back glass. So again, like generally the way it would work is that when you scored 100 points, this part would light up. When you scored 200 points, this other part would light up, so on and so forth. Now, Williams released Army Navy in 1953, which was the first pinball game to feature a rolling score counter. This was a much more economical use of the back glass space that allowed for more room for artwork. Now, one would think that the usefulness of this form would be immediately apparent, and that all other pinball games from this point onward would use a rolling counter. However, it actually proved to initially be rather unpopular, weirdly enough, and it kind of took a while for the idea to catch on, which we will see in a bit. Now, in the 1950s, the industry would face another controversy as it was once again associated with gambling, and this was due to the rise of bingo machines. These were like pinball machines, but without flippers or bumpers, where the player attempted to launch the ball into a series of numbered holes that would light up spaces on a bingo board on the back glass. And these did feature cash payouts. In a way, you could say that this is kind of more in line with the original Bagatelle vision than what pinball was becoming at the time. Now, these were primarily the creation of companies Bally and United, and kind of took a while to sort of rehabilitate pinball's reputation. It took sort of a major court case and a major marketing campaign to convince the public that these had nothing to do with pinball. And also, Gottlieb in particular was really spearheading this. In particular, they heavily sort of advertised the idea that pinball was sort of an all-American thing, that it was as American as apple pie. Ultimately, the bingo machine craze would prove to be fairly short-lived. Now, this table's called Duet. It was created by Gottlieb in 1955. It was the first pinball machine to feature multiplayer. And as you can see here, two players could compete with one another to see who could get the highest score. And as you can see, they've got two different scores for each player. And I believe that, although much like with multiplayer arcade video games, these were primarily turn-based games. There would be a number of other multiplayer pinball games. I think some of them even going as high as allowing for like something like 4 to 8 players, I think. But yeah, these would remain largely outliers, but they were interesting. In the next year, Bally would release a game called Balls a Poppin'. This was the first pinball machine to feature multi-ball, with up to 9 balls on the field at once. We're kind of just burning through a lot of these tables from the time, showing how they innovated. In 1953, Gottlieb released Miss Annabelle. This was ultimately the table that popularized the rolling score reel, which would then become standard. And in particular, it was the first. I completely. I'm pretty sure dogs could hear that. In particular, it was the first pinball machine to feature a high score counter, or here you can see it was called Score to Beat. This added an extra competitive element as players attempted to beat each other's high scores as well as their own. Next is Flipper. This was created by Gottlieb in 1960. By this point, it wasn't uncommon for games to feature a mechanic wherein getting a high enough score would result in an extra game, or what's known as a special. This was usually accompanied with certain lights or sounds going off. Often, in fact, they would utilize what's called a knocker, which is basically just a machine that would knock on the wood and produce a special sound. However, Flipper was the first game to award players with extra balls for getting certain scores. And as a result, it would kind of lead to a sort of divergent sort of ideas for how this system would work. You had either extra game tables, or you had extra ball tables. And this would eventually, of course, serve as the basis for the extra life concept in video games. So we pretty much have this to thank for stuff like the 1-up mushroom, probably. Next is Vagabond, released in 1962. And it was the first pinball game to feature drop targets. This is a series of targets that when each one is hit, it will drop down. And if all the drop targets in the set are dropped, then the player gets a point bonus and the target's reset. This would become another ubiquitous feature on future pinball tables. Next is Swing Along, made by Gottlieb in 1963. It was the first pinball machine to feature spinners. By sending the ball through a lane, the player would spin a flap, and the players gained points based on how much it spun. So the harder the ball went through, the more force it would impart on the spinner. Next up is GG, which was released by Gottlieb in 1963. Well, the same year as the previous one. And it was the first game to feature bonus points. Players could build up a bonus tally that would then be added to their score at the end of the game. Now, this one is called Bankaball. It was released by Gottlieb in 1965, and it was the first pinball machine to feature return lanes. So this is a thin rail that's utilized to split the side-out lanes. So if you look here, you're probably used to this if you play modern pinball tables, but if you knock the ball over here, it will drain, but if you knock it here closer to the thumper, to the kicking rubber, then it will go here and land right where the flippers are. And if we take a look at some of these earlier pinball tables, you can see that they don't have that. You know, it'll either just drain, or the flippers are more or less attached to the kickers. So this was another big innovation, and it allowed for a lot of skill, because you could essentially, with the right plays, you could very easily kind of set up the ball exactly where you wanted it to, and you could launch it exactly at specific targets. Now, these are some more pinball machines from this period. And as you can kind of see, by this point, pinball, as we more or less would recognize it today, has been invented. Now, granted, these pinball machines are rather simplistic by today's standards. They don't have the complex scoring mechanics or missions or stuff like that we have today. By the way, this is a fun one, because I believe that some of these are animated, like in this one, the figure here will get kicked by the horse, and I believe that in this one, it's actually a horse race. So based on the score, they'll sort of move across the backboard, which is pretty cool. But yeah, basic pinball, as we would think of it today, is more or less a thing. But of course, the greater complexity that we have now wouldn't come until later. And of course, by the end of the 60s, pinball had thoroughly penetrated popular culture. And one of the most significant pieces of pop culture about pinball that would be created was Tommy, which was a 1969 album by the Who. This was a rock opera about a deaf, dumb, and blind pinball prodigy. It would later be adapted into film in 1975, and a Broadway musical in 1993. And most notably, there's the track The Pinball Wizard. But yeah, in conclusion, what would eventually become pinball went through a long and complicated process before it became what we think of today. What started as various lawn games would turn into lawn billiards, then regular billiards or pool, then various forms of bagatelle, before finally turning into pinball. Also, as I stated before, croquet, pool, pachinko, and pinball all share a common origin, as we just saw. Now, pinball would gradually evolve over time, with innovation driven by competition between various manufacturers. And over time, they would also become flashier and implement more complex gameplay and mechanical components. Controversies over gambling would have a lasting impact on how the game was perceived for decades. Um, it wasn't until much later that it would be resolved. It would also lead to pinball moving away from being a game of chance and becoming a game of skill. Numerous technological advancements would occur throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s that further enhanced gameplay. And by the end of the 1960s, pinball had more or less morphed into something similar to what we have today, although again, simplistic compared to what we have today. All of this would help set the stage for later video arcade games. Now, we will continue to track advancements and changes in the pinball industry later in the series, especially as it will eventually begin to influence the video game industry. But this is kind of where I wanted to stop with this for right now. Um, for a more detailed look at the history of pinball, I highly recommend there's the History of Pinball series by the channel Bralex, as well as the documentary movie The History of Pinball, both of which are freely available on YouTube, and both of which were immense helps for me in terms of research for this. But yeah, this is the this is the history of pinballs up until the 1970s. I hope you've enjoyed this. Next time we are going to be talking about the rise of arcades. Now, we've already kind of discussed this a bit with pinball, and pinball obviously play a huge part in the rise of arcades, but we're going to be taking a look at sort of more broadly coin-op machines in general, and coin-op arcade games in general. And this will kind of directly lead into video games. And this will be sort of the last sort of lecture we do before we move on to the history of video games. Well, after that, then there's going to be a review, which is kind of just meant for me to buy time while I start making new content for going forward. But yeah. So yeah, we're almost at the end of the history of games before video games. It's been a wild ride. We've been going through 8,000 years of gaming history, but there's more to come, and I hope you guys look forward to it. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation, this lecture. Remember that if you're watching this on YouTube, I stream these lectures every week, Wednesday at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Also, if you are watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Yeah. In fact, I should be uploading this video to YouTube probably by about Sunday. But yeah, this has been a cool one. I've definitely been looking forward to doing this because, again, this very much relates strongly to video games. We're almost there, and I will see you guys next time. I hope you enjoyed this, and take care. See ya.